Scientists are worried that an enormous explosion may happen soon. They even gave it a name, and that is Vulcan. But this has nothing to do with the recent earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. In fact, it's much worse than that. It's about a supervolcano. And those are extremely rare. So what is happening? What exactly is a supervolcano and how likely is it to erupt? Let's have a look. It all started last year when scientists were studying satellite data of the so-called Yellowstone supervolcano in the United States. They found that between 2021 and 2022, its magma chamber had grown by 40 million cubic meters. That's like 160 American football fields filled to the brim with magma. But here's the thing, magma chambers can get bigger and smaller over time. So this isn't in itself a reason to be worried. But then something weird happened because in August of last year, they found that the magma chamber suddenly drained almost all of its newly acquired magma. That sudden drop caught them off guard. And if such a thing was to happen again, it could spell trouble for the whole world. And here's why. Yellowstone is one of the world's 5 supervolcanoes. The others are in New Zealand, Sumatra, Indonesia, and the Mariana Islands. These supervolcanoes are different from regular volcanoes not just because they're bigger, but also because they're associated with huge lakes of magma deep under the Earth's crust. These magma lakes are fed by gigantic mantle plumes that originate deep in the Earth's core, and it's the upwelling magma from these plumes that makes these supervolcanoes so dangerous. See, regular volcanoes usually don't pose much of a threat unless you live nearby. But supervolcanoes can cause global damage because the amount of magma they can release is absolutely mind-boggling. Take, for example, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991. It ejected 7 billion cubic meters of volcanic material into the atmosphere. Now compare this to the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, Indonesia's supervolcano. Its eruption ejected a staggering 350 billion cubic meters of volcanic ash, which was more than 30,000 times larger than Pinatubo. And there's some indication that the Yellowstone supervolcano might be in a state of transition from quiet to active. Since 1985, the area around Yellowstone has experienced more than 1,000 earthquakes per year. That's way more than before. And it's been suggested that the magma chamber beneath Yellowstone has been swelling over the past few decades. If it were to reach a critical size, an eruption could be imminent. Yellowstone has already erupted 3 times in the past. About 2 million years ago, the first eruption created the Island Park caldera. Then 1.3 million years ago came the second eruption, and with it the Snake River Plain. And finally, 640,000 years ago, the third eruption formed the Yellowstone caldera. Each of these eruptions was a little bit smaller than the last. And scientists speculate that this pattern will continue. So the next eruption would be even more violent than the last. So what happens now? Well, the first step is to understand what happened in 2021 and 22. Scientists think they know the answer. There are 2 connected magma chambers beneath Yellowstone, one deeper and one shallower. The deeper magma chamber is connected to the mantle plume. It's always recharging, so it's basically infinite. The shallow chamber, on the other hand, has a finite amount of magma. When the magma in the lower chamber reaches a certain temperature, it becomes less dense and starts to rise. Some of that magma seeps into the shallower chamber. That's what happened in 2021. But since the shallower chamber is connected to the surface, the rising magma creates pressure. If the pressure exceeds the forces holding the rocks above it, the result is an eruption. That's what happened in 2022. The question is now whether this is a one-off event or a prelude to a larger eruption. The problem is that nobody knows because we simply haven't collected enough data. There have only been systematic observations of Yellowstone since 1985. And compared to the timescales on which these eruptions happen, that's pretty much just yesterday. Still, there are some general rules scientists have figured out. For example, it's thought that the intervals between the eruptions become shorter the more frequently the volcano erupts. So if Yellowstone erupts again soon, it'll likely blow up again in a few hundred rather than a few thousand years. In 2022, scientists came to the conclusion that the time until the next eruption might depend on the strength of the previous ones. They studied the 3 previous eruptions and found that the time until the next eruption after the smaller ones was on average 600 years. After the biggest one, however, it was just 140 years. If this trend continues, we should see an eruption within the next couple of hundred years. How big that eruption will be depends on how much magma the volcano has accumulated. Here, scientists make use of a simple scaling law. They take the volume of the magma chamber and compare it to the volumes of past eruptions. This gives them an estimate for how many past eruptions the current magma budget could produce. In the best-case scenario, the current magma budget could support another small eruption like the first one in 1985. In the worst-case scenario, it's big enough for an eruption comparable to the super eruption 640,000 years ago. In 2022, they estimated that there was enough magma for about 8 small eruptions or 1 big one. Now they know that number has decreased to 5 small or 1 large. It doesn't sound good, does it? Well, let me put it this way. You don't need to worry about Yellowstone any more than about Mount Vesuvius in Italy, which buried the Roman city of Pompeii 2,000 years ago. Chances are you won't live through its next eruption. However, unlike Vesuvius, the danger of Yellowstone isn't limited to people living nearby. Should it erupt, winds would rapidly distribute volcanic ash across the whole northern hemisphere. Ash would block sunlight and cause global cooling, but even worse, the ash would contain sulfuric acid that would reflect sunlight and lead to a so-called nuclear winter. That would trigger dramatic climate change and could lead to a mass extinction. Now, luckily, the Yellowstone supervolcano isn't the only one. In fact, there are about 1,500 potentially super-explosive volcanoes on Earth. And the reason scientists are particularly worried about Yellowstone is that it's sitting on top of a fault line. So should it erupt, the amount of ash released would be devastating. But there's another place on Earth where scientists believe there's a much higher chance that a super eruption will happen soon. It's down here in New Zealand. It's a country that most people probably associate with beautiful landscapes and the All Blacks, their national rugby team. But did you know that New Zealand is also home to one of the world's largest supervolcanoes? It's called Taupo, and it's located right in the middle of the North Island. About 26,500 people live within 30 kilometers of the volcano. So, should it erupt, they'd better hope it's not too big. Like Yellowstone, Taupo has been monitored since 1973. And just like Yellowstone, it experienced an increase in unrest in the past decade. In fact, the unrest at Taupo started already back in 2007. But it wasn't until 2012 that scientists realized they were dealing with something unusual. Between 2012 and 2014, the magma chamber grew by 40%. Then, in 2019, researchers found that it had increased by another 20%. That's a lot. And in 2021, they discovered that the magma chamber was steadily losing magma. Within a single month, it shrank by 1.6 billion cubic meters. That's equivalent to 640 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And it got scientists really worried because that was the first sign of an imminent eruption. They tried to figure out how long it might take until it blows up and came up with the following. When Taupo erupts, it doesn't do it all at once but in several phases. During the first phase, magma accumulates in the lower of its 2 magma chambers. When the pressure exceeds the rock's resistance, the magma breaks through and erupts at the surface. This is followed by a second phase in which the upper magma chamber empties. The time between these 2 phases can be quite long, ranging from a few hours to several days. The question is how long the first phase takes until the magma breaks through the rock. It depends on how much magma is in the lower chamber and how strong the rock is. Unfortunately, neither of those quantities is known. The lower chamber could hold anywhere between 30 and 150 billion cubic meters of magma, and the rock's resistance could be anywhere between 40 and 160 megapascals. If you combine all these numbers, you get a 95% confidence interval for the time until the first phase of the eruption. It ranges from less than 1 day to 50 days. So yeah, it could blow up tomorrow. But even if you were lucky enough to survive the first phase, the second phase would be equally dangerous. In 2022, scientists calculated that during this phase, Taupo would eject 360 cubic kilometers of material. The column of debris would rise 30 kilometers up into the atmosphere and cover an area of 26,000 square kilometers in New Zealand. What are the chances that it'll erupt soon? Well, it's hard to say because similar things have happened in the past, but according to a 2022 study, the probability that an eruption will occur within the next 30 years is about 1%, and the probability that it will occur within the next 500 years is about 17%. So yeah, if you live in New Zealand, you might want to keep an eye on this volcano. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.